himself for 5 minutes for an opening statement. Today we take stock of where things stand with the drug provisions implemented in the Inflation Reduction Act. I want to say at the outset that Congress needs to work to address high drug prices. Thankfully, this committee historically has a track record of working in a bipartisan fashion to address this issue. But most of the medical drug pricing provisions signed into law by the Inflation Reduction Act raise serious concerns. That legislation was ostensibly to allow negotiations for the price of Medicare drugs through the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services Drug Price Negotiation Program. This would allow government bureaucrats to so-called negotiate Medicare drug prices. However, the scheme as written is unconstitutional. Recently, President Biden named the first 10 prescription drugs that will be subject to the so-called negotiation. I call it so-called negotiation because it's not true negotiation. It is a Godfather, mafia-style negotiation where bureaucrats at CMS make companies an offer they cannot refuse. A drug manufacturer has two options. One, voluntarily negotiate and face an excise tax of up to 95% of gross sales for that drug if they do not comply with the government's demands. Two, if the drug manufacturer doesn't wish to voluntarily negotiate, they are forced to withdraw all their drugs from Medicare and also Medicaid. Reiterating, a drug company is forced to either accept the drug price the government gives them out of the goodness of the government's heart, or the government will take up to 95% of gross sales from that drug. Or if they refuse to negotiate, the manufacturer loses access to Medicare and Medicaid. The federal government, through Medicare, Medicaid, and CHIP, controls almost 40% of the legal drug sales in the United States. Last week, Health and Human Services responded to legal action claiming that participation in Medicare drug price negotiation is voluntary and that the program does not compel participation. But you must participate or lose access to 40%, almost 40% of the U.S. market on all of your medications. And if you participate, you have virtually no bargaining power. The federal government can take from a private company more money on a medicine than the private company receives or makes from that medicine, unless the private company agrees to the offer they cannot afford to refuse. The private pharmaceutical company is just like the movie producer Jack Woltz in the film The Godfather. Take the government offer or else. This law clearly violates the Takings Clause of the Fifth Amendment. I raised this concern in 2019 when the bill was first presented. No matter how much elaborate wordplay big government apologist lawyers want to use in calling the plan a form of negotiation does not make it true. The fancy words do not change the fact their scheme is a taking. To paraphrase an old saying, calling a skunk by any other name does not make it smell any better. When a competing Republican measure with similar language was briefly brought forward, I voted against that one too on constitutional grounds. Moreover, the nonpartisan Congressional Research Service warned that the price-setting regime in the Inflation Reduction Act was on constitutionally weak legs. There are now 9 legal cases challenging this drug price negotiation program. I am confident that one or more of these lawsuits will be successful and this program will be found to be unconstitutional. This hearing will help us in Congress to understand the aspects of the price control scheme that are most harmful to patients and innovation so that we can craft constitutional bipartisan legislation that brings relief on drug prices without crushing drug research and development. One study says 24 to 49 therapies currently on the market would not be available today if the Inflation Reduction Act was in place during their development. These therapies could range anywhere from cancer, rare diseases, or MS drugs. As our witnesses can testify to today, small molecule drugs and biologic drugs used to treat rare diseases are among those treatments most impacted by the Inflation Reduction Act. Patients rely on the incredible innovation we have had in the U.S., and the provisions we are talking about today will make the U.S. second rate in the world when it comes to the realm of new drug development. We know the American people want lower prices on the most expensive prescription drugs, but we shouldn't sacrifice access to life-changing treatments in the process. That's why it's so important for Congress to fix the worst impacts of the drug pricing negotiation program, and in a manner that is consistent with the United States Constitution. I yield back and now recognize my colleague,